The story of the most infamous disappearance in modern history begins not with a crime, but with the quiet rhythm of a holiday evening. It was May 3rd, 2007. The setting was Praia da Luz, a picturesque village on the coast of Portugal, known for its golden cliffs and family-friendly atmosphere. At the heart of this resort stood the Ocean Club, a sprawling complex of whitewashed apartments and swimming pools where families from across Europe sought respite from their daily lives. Among them was a family from the United Kingdom, enjoying what was meant to be a relaxing break. Your interaction gives a voice to those who can no longer speak for themselves. Hit the like button and subscribe to ensure we can continue to reveal the secrets that have been kept in the shadows. Stay tuned, because you will not believe how deep the roots of this silence truly go. The evening began with a routine that had become established over the course of their holiday. The parents, two doctors from Leicestershire, joined their group of friends, a collective later referred to by the media as the Tapas 7 for dinner. The location was a small tapas restaurant situated within the resort complex. It was an open-air dining area, sitting approximately 70 meters away from the ground floor apartment where the couple's three young subjects were resting. From the perspective of a news report, the logistics of that night are critical to understanding the timeline of the tragedy. The distance between the dining table and the apartment was short, a walk that took less than a minute. The parents and their friends had devised a checking system. Rather than using a monitoring service, they elected to take turns leaving the table at regular intervals to walk back to the apartments and ensure the young ones were unsettled. This method, they believed, offered a balance between adult socialization and parental responsibility. The atmosphere at the table was described as convivial and relaxed. However, the clock was ticking toward a moment that would shatter this tranquility forever. Throughout the dinner, members of the group departed and returned, reporting that all was quiet. The father of the missing individual checked on the apartment at roughly 5 minutes past 9 o'clock. He reported seeing the young subject resting in the secure location, the situation appearing entirely normal. The timeline suggests that the window of opportunity for any intruder was harrowingly narrow. Following the father's check, a friend from the group went to check his own family members at approximately 9:30. He offered to check on the other apartment as well, listening at the door but entering no further when he heard no noise. It was a decision that would be analyzed for years to come. The turning point arrived at 10 o'clock at night. It was the mother's turn to conduct the check. She left the table and walked the short path back to apartment 5A. As she approached, she noticed nothing immediately alarming, but upon entering the living area, the atmosphere felt different. She moved toward the bedroom where the young individual and her two younger siblings were sleeping. In her later accounts to investigators and the media, the mother described a chilling anomaly. The bedroom door, which they had carefully left slightly ajar to allow light to filter in, was now standing wide open. Puzzled, she moved to close it gently. It was then that a draft caught her attention. She stated that as she reached for the door, it slammed shut, propelled by a sudden gust of wind. Confused, she opened the door again and looked into the room. The curtains, which had been drawn shut, were blowing wildly. The window behind them was open. The shutter on the outside was raised. Her eyes darted to the bed where the primary subject should have been resting. The blanket was there, but the soft toy, a pink cat, was lying alone. The bed was empty. The silence of the room was heavy. The mother recounted the immediate, visceral realization that hit her. "I knew straight away that she had been taken," she would later say in interviews. The terrifying thought that a predator had been watching them, learning their routine, and waiting for this precise moment, began to take hold. In that instant, the holiday ended, and the long nightmare began. The moments following the discovery at 10 o'clock were characterized by a descent into absolute panic, a stark contrast to the stillness of the Portuguese night. The mother ran back to the tapas restaurant, her distress visible to everyone present. The table of friends erupted into action, abandoning their meal to rush toward the apartment. This period, often referred to in investigative circles as the golden hour, is crucial for preserving evidence. However, in the chaos that ensued, the scene at apartment 5A was far from preserved. Reports indicate that multiple people, friends, resort staff, and later, local residents, entered the apartment in a desperate bid to search for the missing individual. They looked in wardrobes, under beds, and around the perimeter of the complex, calling out her name into the darkness. From a forensic standpoint, this frantic activity likely compromised the integrity of the crime scene. Footprints were trampled, surfaces were touched, and the precise state of the apartment at the moment of the vanishing became difficult to reconstruct. The local police, the GNR, were called, but the initial response was slow and arguably ill-equipped for what would become a major international criminal investigation. The timeline of silence is a haunting aspect of this case. Investigators later theorized about what happened in the minutes before the alarm was raised. If the mother had arrived just minutes earlier, would she have confronted the intruder? The open window suggested a hasty exit. The shutter, which was heavy and difficult to raise from the outside without noise, became a focal point of the inquiry. Had the person responsible entered through the unlocked patio doors and exited through the window? Or was the window merely staged to mislead the investigation? As the news spread through the resort, a darkness settled over Praia da Luz. The search radius expanded from the apartment to the swimming pools, the tennis courts, and the streets leading down to the beach. The ocean, vast and indifferent, lay just a short distance away, a fact that added a grim layer of anxiety to the search efforts. In the midst of this chaos, the first descriptions of the potential perpetrator began to emerge, though they were fragmented and contradictory. The friends and family were thrust into a state of shock, grappling with the reality that a stranger, a predator, had breached the sanctity of their accommodation. The mother later expressed the sickness she felt at the thought of someone watching them, waiting for the perfect opportunity to strike. The investigation that launched that night would eventually span 3 countries and 17 years. But in those first few hours, there were no suspects, no leads, and no understanding of the complexity of the crime. There was only the empty bed, the open window, and the chilling realization that the young individual was gone. The theory that she was targeted began to form almost immediately, a belief that this was not a random burglary gone wrong, but a calculated act by an individual who knew exactly who they were taking and when to take them. As the sun rose over the Algarve the following morning, the reality of the situation solidified. The local police, initially treating it as a case of a wandering young individual, soon upgraded the status to a potential vanishing. But by then, many hours had passed. The roads out of Praia da Luz had remained open, the borders unmonitored. The person responsible had been gifted a significant head start. The silence of the night had been broken by screams of panic. But the silence from the missing individual was absolute, a silence that has now lasted for over a decade and a half. As the initial chaos at the Ocean Club began to subside into a grim, organized search, investigators turned their attention to the critical question. If someone had taken the young individual, who were they, and where did they go? In the days following the vanishing, the timeline of the evening was dissected minute by minute. It was during this reconstruction that 2 significant sightings emerged, offering the first potential glimpses of the man in the shadows. These accounts would become the cornerstones of the early investigation, driving police sketches that were plastered across news screens around the world. The first sighting, known in investigative files as the Tanner sighting, occurred just 45 minutes before the alarm was raised. One of the friends dining with the parents had left the table to check on her own family members. As she walked up the street, she noticed a man walking away from the apartment complex. She described him to police as carrying a bundle in his arms, a young individual wearing light-colored garments. At the time, she thought little of it, assuming it was a parent carrying a sleeping family member back to their room. It was only after the news of the disappearance broke that the memory took on a chilling significance. For years, this description dictated the direction of the inquiry. The man was described as white, dark-haired, and wearing beige trousers. Police and private detectives spent countless hours trying to identify this individual, believing he was the key to finding the missing individual. Sketches were drawn, and the image of this stranger became synonymous with the case. However, in a twist that underscores the complexity of eyewitness testimony, this lead eventually unraveled. Years later, investigators identified the man seen by the witness. He was not a predator, but an innocent British tourist who had been collecting his own family member from a night facility at the resort. The Tanner sighting, which had consumed vast resources and time, was ruled out, forcing detectives to reset their focus. This elimination brought a second, more ominous sighting to the forefront. The Smith sighting. This encounter took place later in the evening, around 10 o'clock at night, the exact time the mother discovered her individual was gone. A family of Irish tourists was walking back to their accommodation after a night out. They reported seeing a man walking down a street that led toward the beach and the ocean. He was carrying a young individual in his arms. The description provided by the Smith family was markedly different. They described a man who did not look like a typical tourist. He was estimated to be in his mid-30s, with short brown hair and a medium build. What struck the witnesses was the way he held the young individual awkwardly, as if she were in a deep sleep, her head resting against his shoulder. The weather that night was cool, yet the man was not dressed for the climate, and the child appeared not to be covered by a blanket. This sighting aligns disturbingly well with the timeline of the vanishing. If the individual responsible had taken the individual just moments before the mother entered the room, he would have been fleeing the scene at precisely the time the Smith family was walking by. The direction of travel toward the dark, unmonitored coastline suggested a terrifying possibility that the individual was removed from the immediate area of the resort within minutes. The failure to immediately lock down the area is often cited by critics as a catastrophic error. In criminal investigations, the golden hour refers to the period immediately following an offense when evidence is fresh and the likelihood of apprehension is highest. In Praia da Luz, that hour was lost. Border checks were not immediately implemented, and roads leading out of the village were not blocked until much later. The perpetrator had an open road. The sketches generated from the Smith sighting depict a face that is hauntingly generic, yet specific enough to cause unease. For years, this face stared out from missing posters, a ghost that police could not name. It represented the unknown element, the stranger who had slipped into the night while the parents were just 70 meters away. As the investigation dragged on, the inability to find this man fueled the frustration of the public and the despair of the family. The realization that the police might have been chasing the wrong lead the Tanner sighting for so long, while the real trail went cold, remains one of the most painful aspects of the early inquiry. As weeks turned into months, the atmosphere surrounding the case shifted dramatically. The initial wave of public sympathy began to mix with skepticism, and the pressure on the Portuguese police, the Policia Judiciaria, became immense. They were under the glare of the world's media, desperate for a breakthrough in a case that seemed to have evaporated into thin air. Failing to find the stranger from the sketches, the investigative lens turned inward, focusing on the people who were last to see the young individual alive, her parents. This status, translating roughly to formal suspect, affords individuals certain legal protections, but also carries a heavy stigma. In September of 2007, 4 months after the vanishing, the parents were officially named arguidos. The news sent shockwaves globally. The couple, who had been campaigning tirelessly to find their individual, were now being accused of involvement in her disappearance. The theory presented by the local investigators was harrowing. They hypothesized that there had been no taking. Instead, they suggested that the young individual had passed away in the apartment due to an unfortunate accident, perhaps involving substances to help her rest, and that the parents had panicked and hidden the lifeless form. To support this controversial theory, the police relied heavily on a specific type of forensic evidence, the reaction of highly trained sniffer dogs. 2 English Springer Spaniels, brought in from the United Kingdom, became central to this phase of the inquiry. One dog was trained to detect biological traces, and the other was trained to detect specific biological markers or specific biological traces. The police brought these dogs into apartment 5A and later to a vehicle the parents had rented. Video footage from the investigation shows the dogs barking and alerting in specific areas of the apartment, including behind the sofa and near the wardrobe. More damning, in the eyes of the investigators, was the reaction of the dog near the trunk of the rental car, a car that had not been hired until weeks after the individual went missing. The police theory suggested that the parents had hidden the individual's form in a temporary location and then used the car to move her to a final resting place weeks later. However, the science behind these alerts was fiercely debated. Forensic experts argued that while dogs are incredibly sensitive, their alerts are intelligence, not hard evidence. Biological traces can be transferred innocently on clothing or toys. The apartment had been rented by other families before and after the incident, and the car had been used by others. Furthermore, despite the dog's reactions, no physical DNA evidence matching the individual could be definitively confirmed from the samples collected. There was no body, no weapon, and no confession. The parents vehemently denied the allegations, describing the police theory as ludicrous and offensive. They argued that they were being framed by a police force desperate to close a high-profile case. They pointed out the impossibility of the timeline. How could they have hidden a lifeless form while under the constant scrutiny of the world's media and the police themselves? The idea that they could dine with friends, raise the alarm, and simulate a grieving process while concealing a dark secret seemed, to their supporters, a fiction detached from reality. The media storm during this period was relentless. Every expression, every lack of tears, and every movement of the parents was analyzed by body language experts and commentators. The narrative had shifted from a search for a missing child to a trial by public opinion. The parents were trapped in a foreign legal system, fighting to clear their names while still trying to find their individual. Eventually, the lack of concrete evidence led to the lifting of their suspect status. The Portuguese Attorney General ruled that there was no evidence to support the theory that the parents were involved. They were cleared, but the damage was done. The investigation was shelved, leaving the case in a state of limbo. It wasn't until years later, with the emergence of new leads from Germany, that the shadow of suspicion would finally and firmly move away from the family and toward a convicted criminal with a history of targeting properties in the Algarve. For years, the investigation into the vanishing at the Ocean Club seemed to be chasing shadows. The sketches of the man seen carrying a young individual that night had led nowhere, and the intense scrutiny on the parents had dissipated, leaving a void where the truth should have been. However, in the quiet background of the case, a new name began to surface within the files of German authorities, a name that would eventually turn the entire investigation on its head. This individual is referred to in reports only as Christian B. Christian B was not a tourist in the traditional sense. He was a drifter, a man who moved fluidly between his native Germany and the sun-drenched coast of the Algarve. To the locals in Praia da Luz, he was a familiar but somewhat invisible figure, often seen repairing cars or living a bohemian lifestyle that allowed him to blend into the scenery. He resided in a camper van and a dilapidated farmhouse, located just a few miles from the Ocean Club, living on the fringes of the expat community. The profile of Christian B is that of a man who existed in the margins. He took on odd jobs and was known to have a history of burglary in holiday resorts, a detail that immediately piqued the interest of detectives when his name finally crossed their desks. In the world of criminal profiling, a burglar who targets holiday accommodations is often distinct from an offender who targets people. However, investigators soon began to uncover a darker pattern in his behavior, suggesting that his interest lay not just in material theft, but in the vulnerability of the inhabitants. The breakthrough that placed Christian B at the center of the inquiry was digital, not physical. In 2020, German prosecutors made a stunning announcement. They revealed that modern technology had allowed them to trace a mobile phone number attributed to Christian B to a cell tower in Praia da Luz on the night of the vanishing. The data placed him in the immediate vicinity of the Ocean Club at a critical time, just an hour before the mother discovered the empty bed. This piece of evidence, often referred to as the handshake, was pivotal. It contradicted any notion that he was elsewhere. Furthermore, records indicated that the day after the young individual disappeared, Christian B. re-registered his vehicle, a Jaguar, into another person's name. This sudden administrative change, executed so swiftly after the incident, was interpreted by authorities as a potential attempt to distance himself from a recognizable asset, perhaps fearing that the car had been spotted during the events of the previous night. The portrait of Christian B. that emerged was one of a predator who knew the layout of the resort intimately. Unlike the opportunistic stranger theories of the past, Christian B. had worked at the Ocean Club previously. He knew the cleaning schedules, the layout of the apartments, and, crucially, the habits of the tourists who came to stay. The theory suggests that he may have been watching the apartment not as a random passerby, but as a local operative who knew exactly when the parents were dining and when the apartment was left unattended. To understand why Christian B. became the prime suspect in the case of the missing British individual, investigators had to look beyond the events of 2007. They had to examine his history, a record that revealed a chilling pattern of behavior toward vulnerable individuals. The German authorities were not just looking at a thief. They were looking at a man with a conviction for a severe attack on an elderly woman in the same region. In 2005, 2 years before the vanishing at the Ocean Club, a brutal incident occurred in a villa not far from Praia da Luz. An elderly woman was subjected to a horrific attack in her own home. The details of this case, for which Christian B. was later convicted and sentenced to 7 years in prison, established his capability for extreme violence. It shattered the illusion that he was merely a petty criminal. The attack was methodical and prolonged, demonstrating a desire for dominance that terrified those who analyzed the file. However, the pattern did not stop with the elderly. As the investigation into Christian B. deepened, another voice from the past emerged. A young Irish woman, known to the public as Hazel, stepped forward with a harrowing account from 2004. She had been working in the Algarve and was living in an apartment in a nearby town. One night, a stranger broke into her accommodation while she was sleeping. Hazel described an intruder who was masked and armed, a man who subjected her to a terrifying ordeal that lasted for hours. For years, her case went unsolved, a traumatic memory buried under the weight of time and a lack of forensic leads. But when the face of Christian B. was broadcast across the world as the suspect in the Ocean Club case, Hazel froze. She recognized the piercing blue eyes. She recognized the voice. In a dramatic development, Hazel identified Christian B. as the man who had attacked her. Her testimony provided a crucial link for the prosecutors. It suggested that Christian B. was a serial offender who did not discriminate by age. Whether the victim was an elderly woman or a young woman starting her career, the motive appeared to be the same: the exploitation of vulnerability. Profilers analyzing Christian B.'s behavior noted that the transition from attacking adults to targeting a young individual was not a contradiction, but a continuation of his pathology. The common denominator was the defenselessness of the subjects. He sought out those who could not fight back, those who were asleep or alone in secure locations. This insight allowed investigators to view the vanishing not as an isolated tragedy, but as part of a timeline of terror that Christian B. had allegedly inflicted upon the region for years. The discovery of these other victims also served a strategic purpose for the prosecution. While the evidence in the Ocean Club case remained largely circumstantial, reliant on phone data and witness statements, the convictions and accusations in the other cases were grounded in direct testimony and physical proof. By building a picture of Christian B. as a dangerous career criminal, prosecutors hoped to show that the taking of the young individual was entirely consistent with his character. The man in the camper van was no longer just a suspect. In the eyes of the law, he was a confirmed danger to society, a man whose silence held the answers to the fate of the missing little one. The investigation into the vanishing at the Ocean Club eventually led detectives away from the sun-bleached cliffs of Portugal to the industrial gray of central Germany. While the public focus remained on the timeline of that fateful night in May, prosecutors were quietly building a profile of Christian B. that extended far beyond his time in the Algarve. To understand the man they believed was responsible for the taking of the young individual, they had to understand the secret life he led when he thought no one was watching. This pursuit of truth led them to a dilapidated property in Saxony-Anhalt, a site that would yield the most disturbing evidence of the entire inquiry. The location was an abandoned factory site, a sprawling, derelict compound that Christian B. had used as a residence and a storage facility. To the outside observer, it appeared to be nothing more than a junkyard, filled with rusted vehicles, overgrown weeds, and the debris of a chaotic life. However, investigators believed this location served as a sanctuary for his darkest impulses. In 2016, a massive police operation descended upon the property. They were not initially looking for evidence related to the Ocean Club case, but what they found would become the bedrock of their conviction that they had identified a dangerous predator. The search of the factory was exhaustive. Police teams combed through the cluttered living spaces and the surrounding grounds. It was an excavation into the mind of a suspect who lived on the fringes of society. The breakthrough came not from inside the structure, but from the earth outside. In a twist that reads like a grim detail from a crime novel, investigators began digging in the grounds of the property. There, buried deep beneath the soil, they discovered the remains of a dog. For a moment, it seemed to be merely a strange, perhaps sentimental, burial of a pet. But as they continued to excavate beneath the animal's remains, they struck something else. Hidden directly under the carcass was a plastic bag. It was a concealment strategy designed to deter anyone who might be digging. Finding the animal would likely stop most people from looking further. But the police pressed on. Inside the bag, protected from the dirt and damp, was a collection of digital storage devices, USB drives, and hard drives. When forensic technicians later accessed these drives, they uncovered a digital archive of immense proportions. The plastic bag contained more than 8,000 files. The sheer volume of the data was staggering. These were not innocent documents or personal photos. According to official reports, the drives contained thousands of images and videos depicting illegal acts involving young individuals. The content revealed a deep-seated obsession and a history of abusive behavior that spanned years. This discovery was a turning point. It provided prosecutors with concrete evidence of Christian B.'s character and his predilections. While the files did not contain images of the missing individual from the Ocean Club, they established that the suspect had a profound and criminal interest in the exploitation of the vulnerable. It dismantled any defense that he was merely a drug runner or a burglar. The dead dog discovery painted a picture of a man who meticulously documented his crimes and went to great lengths to preserve and hide that record. The psychological implications of the hoard were profound. Profilers noted that offenders who keep such vast trophies often do so to relive their actions, suggesting a lack of remorse and a high likelihood of reoffending. The fact that he buried them at his secure location suggested he knew the gravity of the material he possessed. This was not a casual collection. It was a carefully guarded secret that, once unearthed, made it impossible for law enforcement to view him as anything other than a high-risk offender. For the prosecutors leading the inquiry into the vanishing, this find was instrumental. It allowed them to secure a prison sentence for Christian B. on unrelated charges, keeping him incarcerated while they continued to build the complex case regarding the events in Portugal. It bought them time. The 8,000 files proved that Christian B. was capable of the unthinkable. The question that remained, and the question that still haunts the investigation, is whether the answers to the Ocean Club mystery were once part of that collection, perhaps destroyed or hidden in another location that is yet to be found. The factory search proved that Christian B. had secrets, and he knew how to bury them deep. While forensic teams were busy excavating the buried secrets of the abandoned factory in Germany, a different kind of evidence was emerging from the shadows of the criminal underworld. For years, the investigation into the vanishing at the Ocean Club had been hampered by a lack of direct witnesses. There were sightings of strangers and sketches of unknown men, but no one who could place a specific suspect at the scene with a motive. That changed with the emergence of a man known to the public only as Helge B. Helge B. was not a detective or an upstanding citizen. He was a former associate of Christian B., a man who moved in the same circles of petty crime and scavenging that defined the suspect's life in the Algarve. Their relationship was built on a shared existence on the fringes of society, involving theft and the trading of stolen goods. It was this proximity that made Helge B. the most dangerous kind of witness for the defense, a friend who had heard too much. The turning point in their association, and arguably the most significant verbal lead in the entire 17-year saga, occurred at a music festival in Spain in 2008. It was just a year after the young individual had disappeared from Praia da Luz. The case was still dominating global headlines, and the face of the missing little one was recognizable in every corner of Europe. According to Helge B.'s testimony, the two men were drinking and discussing the events of the day. The conversation inevitably turned to the mystery of the Ocean Club. At that time, the investigation was focused heavily on the parents, and public opinion was divided. Helge B. remarked on the baffling nature of the case, questioning how a young individual could be taken from a room without waking the others or causing a commotion. He expressed confusion about how the perpetrator could have moved so silently. It was then, Helge claims, that Christian B. let his guard down. In a moment of arrogance, or perhaps intoxicated candor, the suspect allegedly replied with a sentence that chilled Helge to the bone. "She did not scream." This four-word sentence changed everything for Helge B. He later recounted to investigators and journalists that the tone was not one of speculation or theory. It was a statement of fact. He described Christian B.'s demeanor as cold-blooded when he delivered the line. Helge stared at his friend, trying to process the implication. To know that the young individual did not scream, one would have to have been there. One would have to be the person who ensured her silence. Helge later stated, "In this moment, he realized he knows it. He has been there." The casual cruelty of the remark convinced him that he was sitting next to the man responsible for the most high-profile disappearance in history. The friendship fractured in that instant, replaced by a burden of knowledge that Helge would carry for years. The tragedy of this revelation is not just in the words spoken, but in what happened next. Helge B. did not keep this information to himself. He claims he attempted to do the right thing. Records indicate that he contacted Scotland Yard in 2008 to report his suspicions and the conversation he had with Christian B. He provided the name of the man he believed was responsible. However, in a devastating blow to the investigation, the tip was reportedly not actioned. At that time, the police were inundated with thousands of calls, many from psychics and well-meaning tourists with vague theories. Helge B.'s call, despite coming from a known associate of a criminal living in the Algarve, was lost in the noise. If they would have acted in 2008, it would have probably made a big difference, Helge later lamented. He tried again. On the 10th anniversary of the vanishing, in 2017, seeing the pain of the parents still plastered across the news, Helge reached out to authorities once more. This time, the landscape had changed. The German authorities were beginning to look at Christian B. for other offenses, and the tip from Helge finally found its way to the right desk. The credibility of Helge B. has been fiercely attacked by the defense, who paint him as a criminal looking for fame or a reduced sentence. However, prosecutors point to his track record. Helge B. was a key witness in the trial regarding the attack on the 72-year-old woman in Portugal. In that case, the court found his testimony to be credible and truthful, leading to Christian B.'s conviction. The authorities believe that if he was telling the truth about the attack on the elderly woman, he is likely telling the truth about the confession at the music festival. The statement "she did not scream" became the centerpiece of the prosecution's theory, providing a terrifying insight into the final moments of the young individual's time in the apartment and suggesting a calculated, quiet removal that only a predator could execute. The revelation brought forward by the witness Helga B., that the suspect allegedly stated "she did not scream," did more than just implicate Christian B. It fundamentally shifted the understanding of the mechanics of the crime. For over a decade, investigators and the public had grappled with the confounding silence of that night. How could a stranger enter a strange apartment, navigate a bedroom where other young family members were sleeping, and remove a young individual without waking anyone? The absence of a struggle or a cry for help had been one of the primary reasons suspicion had initially fallen on the parents. However, the prosecution's theory, bolstered by the alleged confession, suggests a terrifyingly pragmatic explanation. The young individual was likely chemically silenced before she was ever moved. German prosecutors have publicly theorized that the silence was not a stroke of luck for the offender, but a calculated outcome of using sedatives. The investigation into Christian B.'s background provided a specific and chilling detail regarding the method likely employed. Authorities believe that the suspect may have used a chemical agent, specifically paint solvent, to induce unconsciousness. This theory is rooted in the suspect's known history and skill set. Christian B. was a man who worked with his hands. He was known to repair cars and renovate the dilapidated farmhouses he inhabited. These handyman activities meant he had ready and unsuspicious access to industrial solvents and strong chemicals. To a casual observer, carrying such items would not raise an alarm. Yet in the context of the investigation, these tools are viewed as potential weapons. The police files suggest a grim physiological reality. Paint solvent, when inhaled, acts as a strong substance that affects consciousness. The theory posits that the offender administered this substance to the young individual immediately upon entering the room, or perhaps as he approached her. Due to her specific physical constitution, the effect would have been rapid and overwhelming. It would not have required a struggle. It would have simply required proximity. This sedation theory aligns with the witness statement that she did not scream. It explains why the other sleeping family members in the room were not disturbed. It also addresses the Smith sighting of the man carrying a young individual who appeared to be in a deep, unnatural sleep, with her head lolling against his shoulder. If the young individual had been rendered unconscious by a chemical agent, her body would be limp, making her easier to transport but also creating the distinct, awkward posture described by the witnesses. However, this method carries a darker implication that prosecutors have had to consider. The line between sedation and a fatal outcome is incredibly thin, especially when volatile chemicals are involved. The investigation has explored the possibility that the intent may have been to keep her quiet for transport, but the result was an adverse reaction that proved fatal. The use of such strong substances on a young individual carries a high risk of an adverse physical reaction. This hypothesis suggests that the tragedy may have escalated within minutes of the taking, turning a taking into a fatal incident due to the offender's reckless method of control. The "she did not scream" remark also speaks to the psychology of the offender. It implies a memory of the event that focuses on the success of the control method rather than the humanity of the victim. It is a technical observation, a validation of his strategy. For the investigators, this four-word sentence serves as a confession of presence. To know she did not scream is to have been the one ensuring her silence. It paints a picture of a crime that involved forethought and equipment. The offender did not just stumble into the room. He allegedly came prepared to neutralize any resistance. The use of paint solvent, a tool of his trade, demonstrates a chilling resourcefulness, turning a common household item into an instrument of silence. It suggests that when the mother entered the room at 10 o'clock and felt that gust of wind, the tragedy had already played out in a quiet, chemical haze, leaving behind only the empty bed and the devastating questions that remain to this day. For more than a decade, the investigation into the vanishing at the Ocean Club relied heavily on the fallible nature of human memory. Detectives chased shadows based on sketches drawn from fleeting glances, and timelines were constructed from the recollections of traumatized parents and holidaymakers. However, as the inquiry shifted its focus toward the German suspect, Christian B., the most damning accuser against him was not a person, but a machine. The breakthrough that revitalized the cold case came in the form of a digital witness electronic data that had been sitting in archives, waiting to be decoded. In modern criminal investigations, a mobile phone is more than a communication device. It is a tracking beacon. Every time a device receives a call or a text, it communicates with the nearest cell tower to maintain a signal. This interaction, known technically as a handshake, creates a precise timestamp and location record that cannot be altered or intimidated. In 2020, German prosecutors revealed that they had successfully recovered this digital footprint for Christian B., and it placed him at the heart of the mystery. According to the investigation files, the data confirms that Christian B.'s mobile phone was active in Praia da Luz on the evening of May 3, 2007. The records indicate that his device connected to a cell tower that services the immediate area surrounding the Ocean Club. This ping occurred just 1 hour before the mother discovered that her young individual was missing. The significance of this digital evidence cannot be overstated. For years, the timeline of the evening had been dominated by the movements of the parents and their friends at the tapas restaurant. The phone data introduced a new, sinister timeline running parallel to theirs. It placed a man with a known history of burglary and serious offenses within a few hundred yards of the apartment, at the critical moment when the window of opportunity for the taking was open. The analysis of the call logs provided further intrigue. The records show that Christian B. received a phone call at a specific time that evening. The conversation lasted approximately 30 minutes. This duration suggests that this was not a wrong number or a brief pocket dial, but a substantive exchange. The identity of the person on the other end of the line remains one of the great unanswered questions of the case. Authorities have appealed publicly for this person to come forward, believing they hold the key to understanding the suspect's state of mind and specific movements that night. To date, the caller remains a ghost in the machine, their number registered but their identity unknown. While the phone data placed Christian B. at the scene, his actions the following day provided a compelling narrative of flight and concealment. Vehicle records uncovered by investigators show a sudden and suspicious administrative change on May 4, 2007. The day after the massive search for the missing young individual had begun, Christian B. re-registered his car. The vehicle in question was a Jaguar, a distinctive car that stood out in the small village. The timing of the transfer is considered highly incriminating by profilers. Why would a drifter, living a chaotic lifestyle, prioritize paperwork at a vehicle registration office in the middle of a major police emergency? The theory suggests that Christian B. was attempting to distance himself from the vehicle immediately. He transferred the registration to an acquaintance's name, effectively erasing his official link to the car. This behavior aligns with the actions of an offender who fears he has been spotted. Perhaps he worried that the Jaguar had been seen near the Ocean Club by a witness or a security camera. By shifting the ownership on paper, he was creating a layer of separation between himself and the crime scene. It was a calculated move to clean his trail. The combination of the cell tower handshake and the vehicle transfer creates a powerful circumstantial case. The phone data destroys any potential alibi he might have claimed about being miles away at his farmhouse. The car transfer speaks to a consciousness of guilt, a desperate need to hide. In the court of public opinion, this digital evidence is often viewed as the smoking gun. It stripped away the anonymity Christian B. had enjoyed for years. He was no longer just a name in a file. He was electronically pinned to the map, standing in the shadows of Praia da Luz as the sun went down and the tragedy began to unfold. The digital witness does not lie, and in this case, it points an unwavering finger at the man in the camper van. The criminal profile of Christian B. presents a complex and disturbing psychological puzzle that has confounded observers since he was first named as the prime suspect. To the untrained eye, His criminal history appears erratic and contradictory, oscillating between offenses against elderly women and allegations involving young individuals. How can a single offender possess a pathology that targets an individual in their 70s? As seen in his conviction for the severe attack in 2005, and also be the primary suspect in the taking of a little one from a holiday apartment? This apparent discrepancy has been a focal point for defense attorneys and skeptics alike, who argue that the victim profiles are too dissimilar to be the work of one man. However, criminal profilers and psychologists who have studied the case argue that this contradiction is merely an illusion. According to Mark Hoffman, a renowned criminal intelligence analyst who has reviewed the behavioral patterns of the suspect, the connection between these crimes is not found in the age or appearance of the victims, but in their situational helplessness. Hoffman argues that for a predator of this nature, the defining characteristic of a target is not specific interest in the traditional sense, but rather the opportunity for absolute dominance. The elderly woman, living alone, and the young individual sleeping in an unsecured room share a critical commonality. They are both defenseless victims. In the world of forensic psychology, the motivation for such crimes is often misunderstood by the general public, who tend to categorize offenders based on specific patterns. Hoffman's analysis suggests that Christian B. falls into a category of offender where the primary drive is the exertion of power and control rather than personal intent. The act of breaking into a secure location, whether it is a villa occupied by a senior citizen or a holiday apartment housing a sleeping family, fulfills a deep-seated need to trespass and dominate a private space. The predator does not see a person. He sees an object that can be manipulated and controlled without fear of immediate retaliation. This perspective aligns chillingly with the evidence gathered by German prosecutors. If the motive is power, then the vulnerability of the victim is the only necessary trigger. The young individual at the Ocean Club, sedated and silent, represents the ultimate form of vulnerability. By viewing the case through this lens, the disparate elements of Christian B.'s criminal record, the burglaries, the attacks on women, and the alleged abduction coalesce into a singular, terrifying portrait of a man who hunted for weakness wherever he could find it. Further insight into the mind of the suspect has been provided by his own hand through a series of letters written from his prison cell to the media. Over a period of 9 months, Christian B. corresponded with investigative journalist Judah Rabi, offering a rare and unfiltered glimpse into his psychological state. In these handwritten notes, he does not express remorse or empathy for the victims of his past crimes. Instead, he positions himself as the victim of a judicial conspiracy. He writes extensively about his own suffering, complaining about the conditions of his confinement and the threat he faces from other inmates. He states, "I cannot leave the cell because I have to fear that I will be attacked," revealing a profound narcissism. He describes his life as a severe hardship and claims that his path is paved with wrong convictions. This inversion of reality, where the man accused of inflicting unimaginable pain views himself as the one being persecuted, is a classic trait of a psychopath. It demonstrates a complete detachment from the emotional reality of others. He seems incapable of understanding the gravity of the accusations against him, focusing entirely on his own discomfort and the perceived unfairness of his situation. This level of arrogance and self-preservation suggests to profilers that Christian B. is a highly manipulative individual who is adept at compartmentalizing his life. He was able to live in the Algarve for years, drifting between social circles, working odd jobs, and committing crimes, all while maintaining a facade that allowed him to avoid serious suspicion for a decade. He was the man in the shadows, visible enough to be ignored, yet dangerous enough to strike when the opportunity arose. His ability to maintain his silence for 17 years regarding the Ocean Club case, despite the global pressure, speaks to a disciplined and hardened criminal mind. He does not crack under pressure. He deflects it. As the new trial approaches, this psychological armor will be his primary defense. He relies on the lack of physical evidence to maintain his narrative of innocence. challenging the authorities to prove his guilt while he sits in his cell, writing letters that paint him as a martyr rather than a monster. The profiler's perspective leaves us with a chilling conclusion. This is not a man who made a mistake. This is a career criminal who views other humans as collateral damage in his pursuit of control. The logistical mechanics of how a young individual could be removed from a ground-floor apartment and vanish into the night without leaving a single trace remain the most confounding aspect of the investigation at the Ocean Club. To understand the vanishing act, one must first understand the geography of Praia da Luz in 2007, a landscape that, in retrospect, offered a perfect cover for a predator familiar with its contours. The resort was not a fortress. It was an open, sprawling network of public roads and private walkways that intersected with very little security oversight. At the time of the incident, street lighting was intermittent in the residential sectors, and crucially, there was an almost total absence of closed-circuit television cameras in the area surrounding the apartment complex. This lack of electronic surveillance meant that the offender did not need to be invisible. He simply needed to be careful. Investigative reports suggest that the layout of the resort, with its numerous alleyways and access points to the main roads, would have allowed an individual with local knowledge to exit the immediate vicinity of the crime scene within seconds, disappearing into the shadows before the alarm was ever raised. Central to the theory of the extraction is the vehicle associated with Christian B., a distinctive yet commonplace Volkswagen camper van that he was known to live in during his time in the Algarve. Investigators have long hypothesized that this vehicle served as more than just transport. It was potentially a mobile, secure location. The nature of a camper van allows for the concealment of a victim in a way that a standard passenger car does not. If the prosecution's theory regarding the use of sedatives or chemical agents is accurate, the offender would have been transporting an unconscious young individual. The camper van would have provided a secure, enclosed environment immediately upon reaching the vehicle, shielding the victim from the prying eyes of passers-by or other motorists. This aligns with the hypothesis that the taking was not a frantic sprint to a getaway car, but a methodical removal where the offender could place the little one out of sight and then drive away at a normal speed, blending in with the sparse traffic of the coastal night. The destination of this initial journey has been the subject of intense speculation and extensive physical searches over the last 17 years. The region surrounding Praia da Luz is characterized by rugged terrain, vast reservoirs, and abandoned agricultural properties, offering countless locations for concealment. In recent years, German and Portuguese authorities have focused their attention on specific remote areas, including a reservoir located approximately 30 miles from the resort, a place Christian B. reportedly referred to as his little paradise. The implication of these searches is grim. They suggest that the offender may have moved the young individual to a remote location where she could be held or where evidence could be disposed of permanently. The geography of the Algarve, with its deep wells and dense scrubland, poses a nightmare for forensic teams. Despite the deployment of divers, drones, and excavation equipment, the vastness of the landscape has kept its secrets, and the absence of a body remains the primary obstacle to closing the case. There is a particularly harrowing dimension to the timeline that investigators have had to consider: the possibility that the young individual was not ended immediately. The secure location theory posits that the offender may have kept the victim alive for a period of time after the taking. Christian B.'s lifestyle, which involved living in isolated farmhouses away from the tourist centers, provided him with the privacy necessary to maintain such a situation. This theory transforms the narrative from a singular event on the night of May 3rd into a prolonged tragedy. It suggests that while the world was watching the parents and the police scour the beaches of Praia da Luz, the missing individual may have been hidden just a few miles away, behind the walls of a ruin or inside the camper van that was parked in plain sight. This possibility haunts the investigation, as it implies that there were missed opportunities to intervene in the days following the disappearance, had the focus shifted to the local criminal element sooner. Ultimately, The vanishing act was successful because it exploited the gaps in the system, the lack of cameras, the delayed border checks, and the initial assumption that the young individual had wandered off. The offender managed to create a void where a person used to be. By the time the roads were blocked and the borders alerted, the crucial window of time had closed. The camper van, the Jaguar, and the man in the shadows had slipped through the net. Today, the investigation relies on bridging that gap, not with new physical evidence from the scene, which has long since been contaminated or lost, but with the testimony of witnesses who saw what happened in the silence of the aftermath. The mystery of where she went is as pressing today as it was nearly 2 decades ago, a question that hangs over the cliffs of the Algarve, unanswered and unforgotten. While the prosecutors in Germany were meticulously assembling their case using phone data and witness testimony, the suspect at the center of the investigation chose to break his silence, not through a courtroom confession, but through a series of handwritten letters sent from his high-security prison cell. For a period spanning over 9 months, Christian B. engaged in a prolonged correspondence with the investigative journalist and documentary maker, Judah Rabi. These letters, written on standard prison stationery, offer the public the only direct insight into the mind of the man accused of the most infamous vanishing act in modern history. Rather than providing clarity or closure, the writings reveal a complex psychological portrait of an individual who views himself not as a perpetrator, but as a victim of a systemic miscarriage of justice. In his communications, Christian B. adopts a tone of indignation, fiercely denying any involvement in the taking of the young individual from the Ocean Club and dismissing the forensic efforts of the police as a desperate attempt to frame a convenient scapegoat for a crime they cannot solve. The content of these letters is dominated by a recurring theme of persecution, with Christian B. vehemently rejecting the validity of his current imprisonment and the accusations looming over him. He specifically addresses his conviction for the severe attack on the 72-year-old woman in Portugal, a crime for which he is currently serving a 7-year sentence. In his correspondence to Rob, he writes, "I have not committed this crime in Portugal as I am claiming all the time, and that I sit here in prison, totally innocent." He extends this blanket denial to cover all the allegations against him, including the dark discoveries made at his factory and the disappearance of the British young individual. He employs a dramatic phrase to describe his life's trajectory, stating, "My way is paved with wrong convictions." This statement is critical for profilers analyzing his defense strategy. It suggests that he intends to fight the upcoming trials by attacking the credibility of the judicial system itself, painting a picture of a man who has been repeatedly failed and falsely accused by authorities who are under pressure to deliver a culprit to the world. Beyond his claims of innocence, the letters provide a grim and self-pitying account of his daily existence within the German penal system. Christian B. describes his life in isolation, painting a picture of constant fear and vulnerability that contrasts sharply with the predatory behavior he is accused of. He complains bitterly about the treatment he receives, stating that he is unable to leave his cell because he fears for his physical safety. "I cannot leave the cell because I have to fear that I will be attacked or ended by other inmates," he writes, suggesting that his notoriety as a suspect in the Ocean Club case has made him a target within the prison population. He describes the prison administration as complicit in his suffering, claiming that prison does everything to make his life difficult. This narrative of victimhood is a common psychological defense mechanism, allowing the accused to deflect the moral weight of their alleged actions by focusing entirely on their own immediate hardships. By presenting himself as the one who is suffering, he attempts to garner sympathy and shift the narrative away from the pain of the families involved in his alleged crimes. However, the recipient of these letters, Judah Rabi, offers a starkly different interpretation of the man behind the pen. After months of analyzing his handwriting, his choice of words, and the manipulative logic he employs, she concludes that his correspondence is a calculated performance. She notes that despite the volume of his writing, he never inadvertently reveals details that would exonerate him. Instead, he circles around the accusations with vague denials and attacks on his accusers. "This man is dangerous," Rabi observed in an interview, adding that he is never telling the truth. The letters serve as a psychological game, a way for Christian B to maintain a sense of control and relevance while locked away. They are an attempt to manipulate public opinion from behind bars, ensuring that his voice is heard above the evidence. As the legal proceedings move forward, these letters will likely be scrutinized not just for what they say, but for what they omit the truth about where he was and what he did on that fateful night in May 2007. The legal proceedings currently unfolding in a heavily fortified courtroom in Germany represent the most significant development in the broader investigation into Christian B. Yet they serve as a frustrating paradox for observers around the world. While the global public is desperate for answers regarding the vanishing of the young individual from the Ocean Club in 2007, the suspect is facing a tribunal for an entirely different catalog of crimes. This trial is not technically about the events in Praia da Luz, but it is inextricably linked to them by the strategy of the prosecution. Christian B stands accused of 5 separate offenses alleged to have been committed in Portugal between the years of 2000 and 2017. These charges include 3 counts of severe attacks against women and 2 counts of abusive behavior involving young individuals. The outcome of this trial is viewed by legal experts as a make-or-break moment. If the prosecution succeeds, Christian B could face a sentence that keeps him incarcerated indefinitely, buying investigators the precious time they need to finally close the file on the missing young individual. The specific nature of the charges paints a disturbing picture of a man who allegedly operated with impunity across the Algarve for nearly 2 decades. Prosecutors have laid out a case that describes a pattern of predatory behavior, targeting vulnerable individuals in their homes and on the streets. Among the most high-profile accusations is the attack on an Irish woman in 2004, an incident that she kept silent about for years until recognizing the suspect's face in media reports. However, the prosecution faces a unique and formidable challenge regarding the other charges. In several instances, the identities of the victims remain unknown. The case relies heavily on the digital evidence recovered from the buried data devices found at the suspect's factory, which allegedly contained video recordings of the incidents. Prosecutor Hans Christian Wolters has admitted the difficulty of asking a court to convict a man for attacks against victims who cannot testify because they have never been identified. It is a legal gamble, relying on the sheer weight of the visual evidence to prove that the crimes took place, even without the accusers present in the room. The stakes for Christian B could not be higher. Under the German legal system, a conviction on these charges could lead to preventative detention, a special ruling reserved for offenders deemed a permanent danger to society. This would effectively mean that he would never be released, a prospect that one investigator described as the suspect potentially dying in prison. This possibility is the driving force behind the current trial. Authorities are acutely aware that the evidence in the Ocean Club case, primarily circumstantial phone data and witness statements, might not yet be strong enough to secure a conviction for the fatal incident on its own. By proving that Christian B is a habitual offender who has committed multiple severe attacks against women and young individuals, they aim to ensure he remains behind bars, neutralizing the threat he poses while the search for the final piece of the Ocean Club puzzle continues. The defense strategy, however, is aggressive and focuses on dismantling the credibility of the witnesses. Christian B's legal team has argued that the key testimony against him comes from unreliable sources, specifically individuals from the criminal underworld, like Helga B., who they claim are motivated by personal vendettas or the desire for rewards. They have characterized the trial as a targeted campaign driven by the media pressure surrounding the disappearance of the British young individual. The defense maintains that without forensic DNA linking him to the crimes or credible victims to testify in court for all charges, the case is built on speculation rather than concrete proof. This clash of narratives, the prosecution's portrait of a dangerous serial predator versus the defense's depiction of a scapegoat, has turned the courtroom into a battleground where the past actions of the man in the shadows are being dissected under the harshest possible light. For the parents of the missing young individual, this trial is a spectator sport of agonizing proportions. They are not parties to these proceedings, yet their fate hangs on the verdict. If Christian B. is acquitted, he could potentially walk free once his current sentence for the 2005 attack concludes. Such a release would be a catastrophic blow to the investigation, likely allowing the suspect to vanish once again, taking his secrets with him. Conversely, a guilty verdict would validate the theory that he is a dangerous offender capable of the worst crimes imaginable. It would officially label him as a predator who targeted the vulnerable for years, lending immense weight to the theory that he was the one watching the apartment in Praia da Luz on that fateful night in May. The world watches and waits, knowing that while this trial may not carry the name of the missing little one, it carries the weight of her justice. After 17 years of investigations spanning multiple continents, the vanishing at the Ocean Club remains one of the most perplexing and heartbreaking unresolved cases in the history of modern policing. While the focus has tightened significantly around the German suspect, Christian B., the final, undeniable truth continues to elude authorities. The current position of the German prosecutor, Hans Christian Wolters, is one of grim certainty. In numerous interviews with the international press, he has stated unequivocally, "We have no doubt that she is no longer with us." This assertion is not based on a hunch, but on what the prosecution describes as concrete evidence contained within their files, evidence that they have yet to share fully with the public or even the parents of the missing young individual. This withheld information is believed to include sensitive material found during the digital forensic analysis of the suspect's devices, material that investigators claim leaves no room for other scenarios. However, without the discovery of a lifeless form or a specific confession detailing the location of the victim, the legal threshold for a final charge remains agonizingly out of reach. The prosecutor's office finds itself in a precarious position. They are convinced they know who the offender is and what happened, yet they lack the final physical proof required to close the case definitively in a court of law. For the parents of the missing young individual, this state of limbo is a unique form of severe hardship. They have lived for nearly 2 decades in the shadow of the unknown, maintaining a vigil that the rest of the world has largely moved on from. Their stance has remained consistent since the night of May 3, 2007. Until there is irrefutable evidence that their individual is gone, they will continue to believe she could still be alive. This hope, however fragile, is the fuel that has kept their search active. They argue that police theories, no matter how compelling, are not facts. The absence of a body allows for the remote possibility that the young individual was taken and raised elsewhere. A scenario that, while statistically unlikely, cannot be scientifically ruled out without forensic confirmation. This fundamental disconnect between the certainty of the German investigators and the hope of the family creates a tension that defines the current phase of the saga. The parents are waiting for a physical reality, while the police are operating on a deductive conclusion. The legacy of this case extends far beyond the borders of Portugal or the lives of the immediate family. It has fundamentally altered the global consciousness regarding safety and the vulnerability of young family members. The image of the blonde young individual has become a universal symbol of the missing person, a reminder of how quickly safety can be shattered. In the years following the incident, holiday resorts around the world changed their security protocols, and parents became extremely cautious of the dangers lurking in the periphery of their lives. The case highlighted the critical importance of the golden hour in investigations and the devastating consequences of jurisdictional delays. It forced a re-evaluation of how police forces across Europe share information, leading to tighter cooperation between British, Portuguese, and German authorities. The tragedy at the Ocean Club served as a catalyst for a more integrated approach to cross-border crime, ensuring that if such an event were to happen today, the digital and physical dragnet would close much faster than it did on that chaotic night in 2007. As the trial of Christian B. for other offenses proceeds, there is a palpable sense that the clock is ticking toward a resolution, one way or another. If he is convicted and sentenced to life in prison for his crimes against other vulnerable individuals, it may loosen the tongues of those in his circle who have remained silent out of fear. Investigators believe that there are still witnesses, former associates, girlfriends, or fellow inmates who hold the missing pieces of the puzzle. The hope is that once the predator is permanently removed from society, the hold he has over these individuals will break, and the final secrets of the camper van and the reservoir will be revealed. The concept of closure in this case is complex. For the police, it is a conviction. For the public, it is an answer. But for the family, closure is a physical reunion, whether in life or in mourning. Ultimately, the story of the vanishing at the Ocean Club is a narrative of silence. It is the silence of the apartment after the window was opened, the silence of the suspect during interrogations, and the silence of the young individual who has not been seen or heard from since that spring evening. As the sun sets on another year without answers, the file remains open on the desk of the prosecutor, a testament to a determination that has not wavered. The investigation has moved from the beaches of the Algarve to the courtrooms of Germany, stripping away the layers of mystery one by one. The world watches with bated breath, waiting for the moment when the silence is finally broken, and the truth, no matter how painful, is brought into the light. Until then, the case remains an open wound, a haunting reminder of the darkness that can descend when we look away for just a moment.